Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first installment of the MJV Monarch Conservation webinar series for 2023. Thank you all for joining us today and welcome. Today's webinar topic is using community science to track monarchs in the West. My name is Katie Lynn Bunny. I'm the education coordinator for the Monarch joint venture. We're so excited to continue hosting this webinar with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation and Training Center. Before we get started, there are a few webinar community guidelines for the webinar. During the webinar, please put your questions in the chat box and we'll collect those for the Q&A session at the end. And just a reminder to keep the chat friendly and professional. Thank you in advance. This webinar, it will be recorded and will be posted on the NCTC and the Monarch joint venture websites in about 2 to 3 weeks. And the entire Monarch Conservation webinar archive is free and available to watch at any time. It contains about 7 years worth of Monarch Conservation webinars on both of our websites. If you're joining us today, but you didn't pre-register for the webinar, we would love to count you for attendance and be able to show you or to send you our follow-up resources. So please email education@monarchjointventure.org with your name and email address, and we will make sure you get those resources. And finally, all of our webinar speakers represent their own viewpoints, which are not necessarily those of NCTC or the Monarch joint venture. Today, we are delighted to have Dr. Emily Erickson presenting today. Emily Erickson completed her PhD in entomology in 2021 at the Pennsylvania State University. Currently, Emily is a postdoctoral researcher working with Dr. Elizabeth Crone at the University of California, Davis, and Dr. Cheryl Schultz at Washington State University, Vancouver. Emily is broadly interested in developing habitat for declining insects, particularly in urban and suburban landscapes. In her current role, Emily helps coordinate the Western Monarch Mystery Challenge, and she also conducts an intensive survey of monarch butterflies in urban gardens around the California Bay Area. So with that, I will turn it over to Emily to get started.
Great, thank you. Let me get my slides up. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you, Katie Lynn, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here today. I'm really looking forward to sharing with you all some of the results of a study that has been ongoing for the last 4 years that has been really trying to look at some of these questions of what Western monarchs are doing in the early spring using community science. So for some very basic background on Western monarchs, because you will hear that term a lot throughout this talk, there are actually several geographically distinct populations of monarch butterflies in North America. There is, of course, the big one, the eastern migratory population, which is the one that we hear the most about. It's really well studied. This is the population that overwinters in Mexico and then breeds in around the upper Midwest. There is a large non-migratory population in Florida. There are also several other non-migratory populations in other regions, but the one in Florida is pretty significant. And then there's this Western migratory population, and this is going to be the focus of the talk today. And this is a population that overwinters along the Pacific coast between about Mendocino area and Baja. And then they breed inland, generally delimited to the eastern edge by the Rocky Mountains. And as many of you are probably very aware of, migratory monarch butterflies have been experiencing pretty shocking declines in recent years. These declines have been particularly severe in the Western population. And then this figure here, this is adapted from those Xerces Thanksgiving counts. So it might be a little different from what you're used to seeing for the population decline figure. But so the main difference is that the y-axis is log transform. So that might be why the magnitude of values is a little different. But the yellow points here are actual counts from those Thanksgiving overwintering counts at those Pacific Coast overwintering sites. And then black values are extrapolated counts from historic data. And so we've been having these kind of steady declines since the 80s, and with really severe losses between 2018 and 2020, with just under 2,000 butterflies reported at overwintering sites in the 2020 count. So that was a really shocking number. And in a great turn of events, we have had an increase in numbers in the past 2 years, although I will say they are still far below the millions that we have had historically. And there's still a need for conservation of the species. But conservation of migratory animals presents really unique challenges. And this is because migratory animals go through seasonal cycles during which they are occupying distinct habitats, and they're often exhibiting distinct behaviors. And so I'll walk you through the Western monarch migratory cycle, where in summer this is the period of just breeding, range expanding, the population is growing, and they go through several generations. And so at the end of summer is when the population should be the largest and the most robust, and occupying the largest geographic area. In fall, the final generation will eclose. They will enter reproductive diapause, which is a physiological state where they are no longer reproductively active. And they will travel back west towards those coastal overwintering sites, where they will then remain throughout the winter. And the name of the game in overwintering is survival. So the population is not expanding, they're not reproducing. And so we just see this kind of steady decline in numbers during the winter, on average about a 40% loss of population number from the start to the end of winter. And then later on, the remaining butterflies that have made it through, that fall migration and winter storms and all of the other things that might afflict a butterfly that's hanging out on the coast, those remaining butterflies will start to breed at overwintering sites, so that come spring, they can begin dispersing and ovipositing and heading back towards those summer breeding sites. And so spring is this period in time when the population numbers will be the lowest because they haven't been expanding since the fall. And the only surviving adults are those that have made it through fall migration and overwintering, and so they are likely pretty physiologically stressed. So, as we see, migratory monarchs have these varied behavioral states, and then they're also occupying different habitats throughout their seasonal cycle, meaning that each stage will require its own unique conservation management. And effective conservation of migratory animals needs to consider the entire migratory cycle because each of these phases is connected. So for example, if we invest a lot of energy in conservation management of overwintering sites, but say summer breeding habitat is compromised, overall population viability will still be compromised for the migratory animal. This also means that we need to identify the critical points in the annual life cycle that are most limiting to overall population viability. And so for some species, we could consider that period when the population is growing the most to be that critical point in the life cycle. So for monarchs, this would be something like restoration of summer breeding habitat. But it may also be that the period that is limiting is when the population is the most sparse. So that would be in the early spring. And indeed, there have been several studies that have reinforced the importance of early spring for Western monarch population viability. So this figure here is from a paper by Esposette et al. 2016. And I'll walk you through it. It's kind of a difficult figure to interpret on its face. But in this study, what they did was they looked at trends in population declines at individual calendar dates across several years. So essentially what this figure is showing you is if you look across multiple years, what is the kind of general rate of decline across those several years at that period, at that calendar date. It's kind of a weird thing to conceptualize, but all you really need to know is that the more negative the point, the more severe the degree of decline of the Western population over time, over many years. And blackened points are those that are statistically significant. So what you should get from this figure is that kind of cluster of black points around days 50 to 100 shows that early spring has been this point where we've seen the greatest declines in the Western population over long-term data. Another reason why we think that spring is a really important time for conservation of migratory monarchs is if we consider how a monarch population grows. And so we predict that monarch populations, similar to many insects, will grow exponentially. Of course, if things like food resources are not a limiting factor, meaning that the population will expand rapidly as the season goes on. So there might be what starts as a single female in the first generation will lead to many, many more offspring in final generations. Meaning that bolstering the numbers of the population early on in those breeding generations will have a disproportionate effect on increasing the size of subsequent generations. So this figure here to the left is demonstrating that concept where we have the predicted growth of the population during the breeding season if we were to add 1,000 butterflies at either the first generation, which is this kind of middle pink color, the second generation, the light pink, the third, or the fourth, which are those darker colors at the bottom. And so again, just because the population expands exponentially, predictably, if we have more butterflies early in the season, it leads to more butterflies later in the year, disproportionately more if we supplement early in the season. By that same token, we also know that monarch land use expands as the breeding season progresses, and that increases the total target area for habitat restoration. And so managing early spring breeding habitat may also be more efficient. And this is because the habitat, the per unit area effective habitat is greatest in the spring. And so it's really critical that we understand kind of what is going on during this early spring breeding period and where the monarchs, what habitats the monarchs are using during this time. But there are also significant challenges to identifying breeding habitat during the early spring. And so off the go, the first reason is that monarchs are really sparse in the landscape during this time. And so there's limited detection probability when using traditional monitoring methods, which goes hand in hand with the lack of historic records that are currently available, meaning that it's difficult to do this more targeted monitoring in areas that we expect to have more monarchs. So in an effort to address these gaps in the available knowledge, we designed a community science study called the Western Monarch Mystery Challenge. This is a project that is led by Cheryl Schultz and the Conservation Biology Lab at Washington State. And the goal of this study is to just leverage the participation of a large number of individuals in this really vast geographic region who may be spotting monarchs to just gather more records and increase the available data during this time period. And to collect this data on the front end, simplicity is really key. We want to make this as accessible as possible. And so all we ask for people to do is look out for monarchs, and when they see a monarch, to take a picture. And we recognize that photographing a monarch is not always easy. They fly very quickly. They're sometimes very far away. And we can really get a lot of data even from a pretty blurry photo. And so we emphasize to people that your photo doesn't need to be National Geographic quality. It just needs to be verifiably a monarch, and just to send us any photos that they get. Of course, we also encourage folks, if they can get a closer look at that monarch, we can also get a lot more detailed information from that, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But once we have those photos, we ask people to either email them to us directly or to upload them to iNaturalist or the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper. We regularly aggregate data across these databases for this challenge. And of course, with that picture, we ask people to include the date and locality information of their observation. So our challenge is now in its 4th year. The data I'll be showing you today is from the past 3 years. We just recently started this 4th year. We collect data annually between Valentine's Day and Earth Day. And we target our data collection in the Western United States, generally in California and Nevada. When we started this challenge, we knew of the resident population in Southern California, and so we specifically targeted data collection to be north of Santa Barbara so that we weren't confounding the results with these non-migratory butterflies. In the subsequent years since the challenge, there has been an emerging resident population in the San Francisco Bay Area as well. So we have had to kind of figure out data management methods to handle those observations. I'd be happy to talk about those later if anyone is interested in that. So although the call for data on the front end is deliberately very simple, of course there is a lot going on behind the scenes to make a project like this work. And so a big goal of this project was just to increase the participation of people across really broad audiences. So not just people who would already be looking for monarchs in the landscape and submitting those to iNaturalist. And so a major part of this has been promoting the challenge and engaging participants across a range of platforms, including social media, posting things at public parks, sharing them to outreach groups and educational groups. And I want to highlight 2 members of our team, Hannah Mashrolette and Lily de la Esperia, both of whom had a really big hand in this kind of outreach and communication side of the challenge. And I also want to say we have a new team member who's not pictured here. VR is new this year and will also be helping with a lot of this promotional side of things. In an effort to further incentivize participation in the challenge, we offer a weekly prize. It is a good prize. In the past, it's been REI gift cards. That's also what we're doing this year. And we do a weekly post featuring the person who won that week's prize. And winners are selected for a number of reasons. Sometimes they're good stories or kind of an interesting observation. But this is kind of a fun process that we go through every week where we comb through that data and we find these interesting stories. And again, it's just a way to kind of keep people involved and get them excited about participating. We also have developed quite a few educational materials that kind of persist beyond the challenge. Notably, these are some educational materials that you can find on our website that were developed in collaboration with Rubber Duck Labs for a range of ages. And we also have bilingual materials. Again, we really want to make this kind of accessible and engage a really broad audience. So once we get all of the photos that people send to us, we then go through this kind of careful processing step. And so I want to emphasize Jason here, who was an alumnus of WSU, worked on this project for the first 3 years. He's now teaching in Indonesia. We miss him very much on the project, although he is still involved when he is available between his other obligations. And he really developed a lot of the protocols for managing or processing these data. And so every time we get a picture, we get locality and date information. And that's kind of the core data that we get. So from that, we already have a lot of information. We get distribution data. But for a lot of these photos, most of the photos actually, we're able to look at them close enough to get kind of more levels of detail. So the first thing that we look for is the butterfly sex. That's a really kind of quick thing to determine. In monarchs, males have these kind of black glands on their hind wings. You can see that's in the right hand picture, at least on my screen. And the females do not have that. And males also have kind of generally thinner coloration on their wing veins. So we sort them according to butterfly sex. And then we also score them on something called wing wear. And so wing wear is just how worn the butterfly looks. So how tattered the wings are, how faded the butterfly is. And this is a pretty general proxy for butterfly age, or when the butterfly likely eclosed. And so this is a really valuable metric because it allows us to predict whether the butterfly is likely a butterfly that eclosed the previous summer or in fall, and then was part of that fall migration inland, overwintering, and then dispersed in spring. So this butterfly on the right, that male monarch that I pointed out, that is a pretty good example of a butterfly that looks pretty worn and is likely a butterfly that overwintered. Whereas if it's a kind of bright butterfly that doesn't have much wing wear, like this one on the left, this female, we can predict that this is likely a butterfly that eclosed in the current spring. So as part of that first spring generation. So going through our results, the first thing that we wanted to see was all of our efforts to promote the challenge and advertise the challenge and engage participation, was that effective in increasing the total number of monarch records? So this figure here is the number of monarch records from before the challenge, so on iNaturalist in beige, and then after the challenge in orange. And I will say these are records of monarchs that we determined were likely not resident butterflies, were during the early spring period, and in that geographic range that we were interested in. So the numbers are pretty low, as you can see in the historic data, on the magnitude of like 1 to 5 observations a year. And we did find that we see a significant increase in the number of records in the years following the challenge. Most notably in 2022, we got a huge boom in number of records, which is really exciting. And there are probably lots of explanations in why we see those differences. We feel fairly confident that it is not just reflecting the numbers of butterflies in the landscape. So if you overlay this with overwintering counts, for instance, you can see that there were actually more counts in 2019 during that New Year's count compared to 2020, but we had more records in 2020. So it's probably not just explained by the total numbers of butterflies in the landscape. And it may be in part our efforts to advertise the challenge and promote people submitting monarch observations. It likely also reflects in large part just increased public awareness and interest in monarchs, especially in those years following that crash. When we look at the distribution of the monarchs, the monarch records that we got, so I'll walk you through this figure because we'll return to it a couple times. This is just a map of those records where each point represents an individual monarch. The color of the point represents its wing wear. So blue points are those butterflies that were kind of fresher, less worn, likely eclosed the current year. Red points are butterflies that likely eclosed the previous fall. And then orange points are those that we could score, but we couldn't determine if they were current year or previous year butterflies. Gray points were unscorable observations, so they were too far blurry. So you can see we actually get a lot of observations that we can score the wing wear. And the shape of the point is whether or not it was data that was collected during the Mystery Challenge years, so between 2020 to 2022, or in years prior to the challenge. So we did aggregate kind of that historic iNaturalist data as well. And so the first thing that we see is that monarchs are really dispersing pretty broadly across the landscape. They're using a pretty wide area during this early spring breeding period. The vast majority of those records were contained within California and were to the west of the Sierras. There are a couple interesting records that you probably see standing out to you in this more desert region. It's kind of this Death Valley region. And it's hard to say where those butterflies came from. There are some inland overwintering sites, so they could be from there. But so I'd kind of take those with a grain of salt. But the general trend is that we find they're within California and to the west of the Sierras. When we look at just the older butterflies, so those butterflies that were really worn and tattered and were very likely butterflies that eclosed the previous fall, so those red butterflies, we again see that they're distributed really broadly, indicating that after leaving the overwintering sites, they can travel pretty far inland. So they're not just, mating, ovipositing, and then dying right by the overwintering sites. They seem to continue to move inland. And indeed, we do see that there is a statistical relationship between this. So this figure here is a prediction plot from a linear regression. For those of you that are not statistically minded, that is okay. All you need to know to interpret this is that the x-axis is just how long has it been since we started the challenge, so the day of the year, the date, and then the y-axis is how far would we expect to get a record from the overwintering site, from the closest overwintering site. So just what we see is as the season goes on, as we get later in the spring, closer to that Earth Day cutoff, the records that we are receiving seem to be further inland. So it's just showing that the range of the population expands as the season goes on. This is what we would expect. When we look at observations of current year butterflies, so these are these fresh, not very tattered butterflies, those butterflies that very likely eclosed in the current spring. We see that, again, they're following this similar range to the overwintered butterflies. And this is kind of an interesting result because we see that breeding is definitely taking place during this period. So this is a time when reproduction is happening. And then, of course, having a recently eclosed adult is not a perfect proxy for natal origin, but it does show that kind of breeding is likely taking place across the landscape. So it's not just localized in one spot. And again, there is this relationship between space and time for these observations. This is a similar figure to what I just showed you. Again, where the x-axis is the time since the start of the project. So you can think of that as calendar date. And then the y-axis is different. This is the percent of records that we are receiving at that time point that are butterflies that eclosed in the current spring. And then the color is the distance from the overwintering site. So the way that we can interpret this is to say if you were to stand 10 kilometers from an overwintering site early in this challenge, so mid-February, there would be about a 30% chance that all of the monarch records that you see, 30% of them would likely be current year butterflies. So that indicates that this breeding is probably happening closer to overwintering sites early in the challenge. If we stand further from the overwintering site later on in the season, so closer to April 22nd, Earth Day, we go to about a 20% of our records being of these current year butterflies. So again, this is just showing that this breeding is kind of moving inwards as the season progresses. The next way I looked at this data was I plotted those same records across ecoregions. So ecoregions are these kind of geographic zones with unique ecologies, climate, etc. These are broadly adapted from the EPA ecoregions, but modified for kind of what was biologically relevant for monarchs to be the coastal foothills, the California Central Valley in green, the Sierra Nevada foothills in yellow, and then the Mojave Desert and Basin in purple. And on this map, we have black records are all adult monarchs observed in the study. And then I added supplemental records, those points in white, of any larvae that were observed submitted to iNaturalist. And so this is data that can kind of be used to supplement these predictions about breeding in these regions, because caterpillars can't travel very far. So if we have a caterpillar on milkweed, it was very likely from an egg that was laid on that milkweed in that region. And so again, we see that monarchs are distributed broadly, and they're really present in diverse habitats. So we know that these ecoregions are all pretty distinct from one another. And so from a management perspective, this really reinforces that building spring habitat will not be a one-size-fits-all approach. So we're going to have different management approaches for different ecoregions. And we did find some patterns in where the records were more abundant, that were not just explained by different properties of the ecoregions, such as the size of the ecoregions or the human population density. On the whole, we see more observations out of the foothill, both the eastern and the western foothill areas, and fewer out of the Central Valley. But I want to say this with the huge caveat of that this study is not designed to compare habitat quality or really relative abundance in these areas. So take this data with a big old grain of salt. The variation in these numbers could reflect all sorts of factors, including things like sampling intensity. But there have been several really compelling studies that have shown that the Central Valley was historically monarch habitat, but has since been a pretty heavily modified landscape due to agricultural intensification. And so I think what we can take from this is that, there are monarchs that seem to be stopping by these habitats, and it's worthwhile to do kind of more systematic comparisons of habitat quality and survival probability in these habitats and between these regions to better inform management across the state. And now, when we talk about habitat, of course, we can't not talk about milkweeds. And I want to kind of highlight this, but with the big note that this was not something that we asked for in our study. We did not ask for milkweed observations for several reasons. Again, the goal of our study is simplicity and accessibility. And so we want to give people one thing to send us a picture of, and that's monarchs. And we didn't want to kind of pile on the assignment. That said, we get a lot of observations of larvae, and a lot of those are on milkweeds that we can identify. And so I kind of want to talk about this really quickly, just because there are some cool projects that are taking a better look at milkweed. And because when we talk about spring habitat, we are talking about milkweed on the whole, spring breeding habitat. And this presents kind of an interesting challenge, because most of our native milkweeds in California will not be out of dormancy during that early spring breeding period. I don't know how many of you are on the West Coast, but right now it is pretty miserable weather. It is hard to believe that much would be growing during this time, although we do see monarchs are active. And so kind of to first get a look at this, I went through those larval records and I identified those that I could. I identified their host plant species. And then each point here on this map is an individual larval record. They're really big points so that you can see them better because the colors are kind of similar looking. But the color of each point corresponds to the milkweed species that larval record is on. So the red points is Asclepias californica. These gray points are cordifolia. And then this blue point is Ariocarpa. I want to first highlight these because this is what we get the most abundant, or this is what most of the records were on. These are typically what we think of when we think of early season native milkweeds. So this is a cool result. It shows that, they are using these milkweeds during this period. And, we should be looking more into kind of where these milkweeds are distributed and kind of what habitats these milkweeds can grow in throughout the breeding range. I will very briefly say we also saw some records on not milkweeds that we typically think of as early season milkweeds, including speciosa, so showy milkweed, tropical milkweed, and fascicularis, narrowleaf milkweed. These were generally on kind of smaller plants, and of course, tropical milkweed is going to be evergreen, so it's not surprising that that's offering a resource. But anyways, just things to kind of think about when we talk about spring breeding habitat. And so if you're interested in contributing to our knowledge on early spring milkweeds, because we really do need a lot more data, both on which early season milkweeds are being used by monarchs during this time and where they are distributed in the early season breeding range. I encourage you to kind of keep your eye out for milkweeds as you're out recreating, and submit any observations that you may have to the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper. This is currently the best database for aggregating those observations, and we do get some of our data from the mapper. And of course, if you leave this talk and you're like, oh my gosh, what was that website that Emily said I could submit my milkweeds to? You can also just email them to us and we can make sure they will get on the mapper. We make sure that all of our observations end up on the milkweed mapper. So just to wrap things up, we see from this data that community science has a great potential for increasing available records of a recognizable species, particularly when it is sparse and when it's distributed broadly. We have great indication that spring is a really critical part of the life cycle, but it is relatively understudied, and that's because data has historically been limited. And so we really need a lot more research to understand the best paths forward for management during this period. From our fairly preliminary broad look data, we do have some preliminary information on what they are doing. We are seeing that they are kind of moving inland throughout the season and that they are dispersing broadly within California and across diverse habitat types. So again, this means that conservation management will have to be a multi-pronged approach during this period. And of course, when we talk about management, a major part of this management will be identifying the appropriate early season milkweeds for these ecoregions and figuring out where they are distributed. And again, I really strongly encourage anyone who is passionate about milkweeds to get involved in some of these other community science projects, such as the Milkweed Mapper, and submit your observations there. And of course, I want to give a big plug for folks to contribute to our ongoing research. So we are, as I said, in the 4th year of the challenge. We are going to be accepting photo submissions until April 22nd, Earth Day. Please, of course, yourself participate. Send us any photos you may have. Follow our social media. That's a great place to kind of keep up to date with the goings-on of the challenge. And if you scan this QR code, it will actually link you to all of those, the Conservation Bio main website, and that'll be a great place to get links to our social media and more information about the challenge. And of course, I encourage you to share this widely among your own networks. Really, the more folks who are tuned in to this research, the better. The more observations we will get, the more data we will get during this critical period. And so I just want to give a big thanks to the Crone Lab. This is the UC Davis contingent of the Crone Lab. There's also many of us still at Tufts University, as well as the Schultz Lab at WSU Vancouver. Thank you so much to Monarch Joint Venture for having me here today and for supporting this work, as well as thank you to the Xerces Society and WAFWA and others who have contributed to this project throughout the years. And with that, I will take any questions. This QR code is still here. This will link you to the Conservation Bio Lab, excuse me. And then my email is here at the bottom. Please feel free to reach out if you have anything that comes up or if you want to get any specific materials.
Thank you so much, Emily, for sharing your knowledge. We are going to take the next few minutes for some Q&A. If we don't have time for every question, we'll do our best to get them answered at another time and include those in a follow-up email. For now, let's start with a couple of things that have come in. And keep the questions coming. We've got lots of time for questions today. There were a couple of questions for Eastern-related things, so I'll just address that right now. The Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper and Emily's topic right now is just focused on the West. So there will be some other webinars later in the series that will address Eastern monarchs, but this webinar is specifically for the Western monarchs. But Emily, a couple of questions for you. What's the sorry, reading through questions as things are moving around on my screen. If one takeaway is that monarchs seem capable of using such a wide variety of landscapes and habitats, then which ones, if any, should be the focus for conservation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one that honestly, this data doesn't really address. So what this data gives us is a better idea of where to start looking at these kind of more systematic comparisons of habitat. And I know there are other studies that are doing this research. And so I mean, I can't kind of tell you which one is the more important or the priority for conservation. And I think the way forward with that is to, do milkweed plantings across these habitats and monitor use in these landscapes and do these, again, more systematic comparisons of habitat use.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the next step. Now that we know that they're kind of across these landscapes, we can actually kind of start to do these more detailed questions.
Yeah. Yeah, and kind of related to that, another question someone had was, how does habitat management vary with ecoregion?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, so each ecoregion, they're pretty distinct. And again, I am not a habitat manager myself. I am somebody who writes a lot of R code and stares at this data on a computer. So there are probably people that know the answer to this question much better than I. But, I do know that, so for instance, on the North Coast, we have a lot of urban areas. And so a lot of habitat on the North Coast is in these kind of more managed green spaces. I do know that there are some really great, really big initiatives in the Central Valley to do some pretty large scale restoration. Of course, the Central Valley has historically been kind of mostly just agriculture and monoculture. So there are these really big efforts by, I believe, River Partners, and I'm sure there are other people that I'm forgetting who are involved in that project, who are doing some big plantings in the Central Valley. And then in the Sierras, I am not aware of anything. That doesn't mean it's not happening there. But again, this is why we kind of need a better understanding of kind of what milkweeds are already there and where those milkweeds are. So,
yeah.
I wish I had better answers to all of your management questions, but yeah, okay. I just pass off.
Okay. For anybody who's looking for more resources on these types of things too, you can check the MJV website or the Xerces website. And if you can't find what you're looking for, feel free to email us and we're happy to help you find resources on those types of things too. Emily, another question for you. Have you thought of including sightings reported to Seek or iNaturalist in some of your data as well?
Yeah, so we do include iNaturalist. That's actually where we get a ton of our observations. That's probably where we get most of our observations because folks do use iNaturalist pretty broadly. Seek, so for those of you who are not familiar with Seek, Seek is a branch of iNaturalist that does kind of real-time AI identification of, anything you ask it to. And it's a great tool. I use Seek all the time. The difference between iNaturalist and Seek, and why we can't use that data from Seek, is that your observations in Seek are stored locally, so they're not uploaded to the global database as they are in iNaturalist. So we don't have access to what people are looking at in Seek. I love using Seek. I think it's great, especially if you're in a place with kind of limited data, or just to get like a first idea of what you're looking at. I try to upload my Seek observations to iNaturalist as well, probably because I spend a lot of time working with iNaturalist data, so I feel strongly about the power of kind of this crowdsourced data. But yes, so we do use iNaturalist. We don't use Seek because we can't use Seek.
Right. Okay. How has the growing residential population in Southern California impacted this research?
Yeah, so let's see. So we get a lot of, I can speak less to the one in Southern California, more so I can speak to the one in Northern California, which is also the population that I study kind of in my other work. So we get a lot of observations out of cities. I would say probably 90% of our observations are out of cities. And, I think this is for a variety of reasons. The simplest reason is there's more people in cities. So we just have more people who are walking around with their smartphones and taking pictures of monarchs and uploading them. Also if we have year-round breeding in cities, it's very logical to think that, there's higher likelihood that people are just submitting more photos of monarchs that they're seeing sticking around their gardens. We were very deliberate to remove any observations of potential resident butterflies from this data because we wanted to be really thoughtful that what we were getting was the spring migration. And so we had to do a pretty intensive data cleaning process for this, which essentially meant removing any observations of butterflies that were in urban gardens where tropical milkweed could be evergreen. And this is because, having tropical milkweed where it grows year-round is very likely kind of the support for why we have resident butterflies. And so that was why we removed these observations out of coastal cities. And of course, that might mean we're also removing true spring migratory butterflies that are stopping off in urban gardens. And that's just unfortunately a compromise we have to make with our data to make sure that we are not confounding it with the resident butterflies. But yeah, that was definitely a data management problem we had to face. And it's been interesting. I mean, it's been interesting to see the increase in observations out of cities. And we do get a lot of them out of Southern California as well in recent years. So just representing this growing population.
And Emily, just a clarifying question related to that. That doesn't mean the data from those cities or potentially resident populations aren't useful. They're just not used to answer this particular question. Is that right? So if you're in one of those residential cities, still report all of your monarchs and your milkweed that you're seeing. And it can be used in very helpful information in other contexts, just not for this particular question.
Yes, totally. Thank you for that clarification. We accept all observations. We get a lot of observations out of cities. That in itself is really interesting and really usable data. And actually from that data, we're able to kind of validate these observations of year-round breeding. So submit those observations. We love them. We'll take them. We're happy to have them. We don't want to discourage anyone from submitting an observation, no matter where they are. But yes, for this specific question on kind of the early spring migration, we do remove those populations. But it's great to still have those data for future investigation.
Okay, we've still got lots of time. Okay, so there's 2 more questions I want to make sure we get to. The first, do you have any pollinator or listed species career advice? This person says they're a mid-level conservation professional and looking into doing this kind of work.
Pollinator career advice. I mean, yeah, now is the time if you want to get a job in pollinators. This is the time to do it. I mean, there's a ton of really great initiatives in pollinators. Of course, I've taken a research path, which I've found to be just incredibly fulfilling. And I also know there's a lot of management agencies and nonprofits that are doing really great work. And so I think the advice I would take is kind of figure out what your interest is in terms of that. Do you want to be on the research end or the management end? And there are many opportunities out there, both in monarchs and just general pollinator stuff. My background is actually more so in native bee communities, so I can also speak to the fact that there's a lot of really great work going on in that space. So, and I encourage you, if you have a specific question, feel free to reach out to me via email, and I'd be happy to chat with you about that.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of add to that too, depending on the type of work you're looking for, to check with pollinator conservation organizations, look at their job boards and just kind of see what's being posted. I know I've seen a few come through our partner channels within MJV that there's a few organizations that are hiring or have hired recently, so keep an eye out in those spaces too. Okay, we'll get to this question and then we'll see if there's any more that come through. With excuse me, with tropical milkweed so popular in residential suburban neighborhoods, how does restoration management look in these locations, and what milkweeds would be suggested in place of tropical milkweed for homeowners?
Yeah, that is a really big question. And so that is kind of the focus of my other research. And there is, let's see, the tropical milkweed question is a big one. So with the emerging resident population, we are really working on untangling kind of how the dynamics of that year-round breeding. So when we talk about tropical milkweed, we also kind of think of these non-migratory butterflies in urban gardens. And we're really trying to get a better idea of the dynamics of the migratory population and those urban gardens, and whether urban gardens are either adding a food resource for migratory butterflies, or whether or not they're kind of acting as a population sink. And this is kind of ongoing research that I am currently working on, and other folks have been working on. I personally kind of take the precautionary approach, and I recommend to folks in cities to plant native milkweeds. There are a couple native species that are really pretty accessible, including Speciosa and Fascicularis. So those are a great option if you want to put native milkweeds in your urban garden. And we stay tuned on the tropical milkweed question. It's something that it's complex, and there's lots of layers to it. And we are working to get a better understanding of how to use tropical milkweed in terms of the migratory population and how it's factoring into abundance of the migratory butterflies.
Yeah, and we will be sure to include some resources in the follow-up email with plant lists for the West, links to where you can find lists for your region and things like that to help you find alternatives to tropical milkweed, if that's something that you want to explore for your own home gardens.
I also want to give a big plug to, I want to say, if you don't plant milkweeds in your garden, nectar plants are also a really important food source for adult monarchs, and are often, I think, overlooked when we talk about planting for monarchs. So, of course, milkweed is what the larvae need, but adults need nectar. And so you can just have a flower garden, and that is playing a really important role in terms of monarch and just broadly pollinator habitat.
Yeah, and sorry, I have a colleague who is watching the webinar today, and she wants me to promote one of our programs, which I should have thought of to start with. So the Monarch Joint Ventures Monarchs and More Western Habitat Program provides native wildflower seeds and milkweed plants for growing habitat in California and Southern Oregon, which is now open. So you can find information for that on our website, and we will be sure to include that in the follow-up email as well. And we've got about 5 minutes left of the hour, so I just wanted to ask one, maybe two more questions. We'll see how long they take, and then I will. Oh, and it looks like Erin put that resource in the chat. So if you want to click that link that Erin just put in the chat about the Monarchs and More Habitat Program in the West, feel free, but we'll put that in the follow-up email too. Emily, someone was asking, have you experienced challenges with getting people involved in this program, or did people adopt it pretty quickly?
Oh, that's a good question. So the fun part about working with monarchs is they're a really easy sell. They are a species that people both recognize really readily, and people generally have very positive associations with monarchs. And so in terms of getting people on board with, why we need help with monarch conservation, I mean, that in itself is a big selling point. Is, do you want to help with monarch conservation? People love that. I think, the biggest challenge that we have faced, and to be perfectly honest, I don't know if we figured out a good way to overcome it, is how to engage people, kind of consistently engage people who are outside of the general sphere of folks who are interested in monarchs or pollinator gardening. So that has been kind of the biggest challenge that we have been working through, and we've been trying to employ some kind of creative techniques to get this content to kind of audiences that are historically not participating in this sort of research. So for instance, we have been working on contacting local parks and hiking areas and having them put up flyers. Particularly in the Central Valley, this is kind of an area that historically has had very few monarch records. And, is that because there aren't as many monarchs to see, or because there are kind of other, differences in how people are spending time outdoors or observing monarchs in these regions? And so, so we've done a lot more kind of targeted promotion in these areas. We also do targeted paid advertising in certain areas. And again, that's just to get this information out to folks who would maybe not typically be engaging with this monarch content, because it's pretty, we can get this information out to people who are interested in monarchs pretty quickly, or maybe interested in monarchs isn't the fair word, but people who are kind of already active in this world fairly quickly. And that's the biggest challenge, has been engaging these other audiences.
Great.
But I was just going to say, we do find that once we're able to get folks that content, they usually are pretty interested in getting engaged. So that's really a promising thing.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Emily. We are in just 1 minute until the hour. I know that there were a few more questions that were in the chat that we will answer in an email, in the follow-up email. They're things that MJV staff can certainly answer your questions on. If you have any specific questions on Eastern monarchs, feel free to email me at education@monarchjointventure.org, and I'd be happy to answer your questions there as well. That is all the time we have for questions today, though. So I want to thank Emily again for presenting today, and NCTC for hosting our webinar, and to all of you for participating. We hope to see you next month, March 28th, same time. The topic next month for next month's webinar is planning your habitat garden. We will have presenters from the Eastern population and the Western population to answer questions about and present on the different habitat requirements that you might come across in each of those regions. So we hope to see you there. With that, we'll close things off. Thanks again, Emily, and we'll see you all next time.